I'm William Brown. Please join me for a stroll down Fan Alley. It is the fans that keep something alive and vital, and we're going to explore several fandoms. We're going to start this series with what was the first fandom in America, Sherlock Holmes. We're going to chat with three fans from the Confederates of the Wisteria Lodge, the Atlanta Sherlock Holmes Society. But first, we're going to have a conversation with author and director Tony Serecchia, who tells us how he became interested in Sherlock Holmes.
I got to Sherlock Holmes through Encyclopedia Brown. I don't know if you remember the Encyclopedia Brown boys' adventure books or children's adventure books. And he was essentially a kid who was, I think he was 12 years old. And he would, his father was the police chief, and he would solve, I don't think he ever solved a murder, but he would solve like who stole the bike, who did the, and he was a very clever kid. And I think an uncle must, ask me about it, and he said, "Well, you'll really like Sherlock Holmes." And then I moved on to, I went through like not really the Hardy Boys, but that other series, a couple of the other series, and then to that I went into to Sherlock. So I found Sherlock fairly young. So my favorite story is probably oh my goodness, the Scandal in Bohemia. And the reason for that is that's the first time I ever saw a hero sort of lose, right? Because in A Scandal in Bohemia, that's where Irene Adler, I don't know if she's very clever, right? And in that process, I had never seen like the hero not get the 100% win, and that impressed me. That this writer, the creator, was so comfortable with his with this creation that he could put him in a position to where he sort of loses, but he sort of wins, and it's still cool. You still like the character. So I just thought that was that just blew my 12-year-old-ish mind away that could happen. And being 12 and that he lost to a woman was even more, just blew me away. So I think that's probably my favorite. And then kind of the Moriarty ones are always good. I guess even at that young and tender age, I liked the story arc, right? Even though the arc was disjointed, but I liked that continuing, the character who would come back.
In terms of adaptations, who was your favorite actor who played Holmes in an adaptation?
Well, let's see. So I have a nostalgia for, was it Basil Rathbone? And is that the right, in
Basil
the early?
Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, yes.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So I have a nostalgic kind of feeling for that, but I think Benedict Cumberbatch just blew it away.
I think he really did a good job with it.
He was just awesome with the character. Yes. So Sherlock infected my life. So Lady Sherlock, which I started almost as a lark with Bill Rich, has actually was my ticket into the Mystery Writers of America Association. So, and a lot of people are very happy with Lady Sherlock, and they're waiting for recorded versions of it to be out there. So yes, Lady Sherlock has been. I don't know that she's grown as much as I don't know that she's as well known as Harry Strange is, but her in her areas like a 221 Con, and even some of the folks at DragonCon know me more as the guy who wrote Lady Sherlock than anything else. I just got to say, it's an amusing story. Bill and I were actually out to dinner one night. Bill Rich is president of ARTC, as you know, and we were talking about the BBC Sherlock, and I said, I doubt they would ever have an American writer write a Sherlock episode, but I would love to write one. And he said, well, you can always write one for us. And a couple months later, I kind of blew it off. And then, I was thinking about it and I was like, we could do Sherlock as a woman. And I bet that would be pretty cool. And so I called him and he was very excited about that. And I want to add, this was probably 3 months before the BBC announced that Doctor Who was going to be a woman. So I'm just saying we were ahead of that curve. So
Okay. That was Atlanta author and producer of audio drama Tony Serecchia. You can find out about his interests by visiting his website, tserecchia.com. That's TSARRECCHIA.com. Our next Sherlockian is Gordon Shriver. Gord, as he is known, used to work with me in the early 90s at Georgia Public Radio and tells us how he came to Sherlock Holmes.
As a kid, I had a hardcover children's version, condensed, of Sherlock Holmes, of the Doyle stories. So I was probably 10 or 11, thereabouts, when I read those. And then when I was 12, my family moved to the Chicago area, where WGN there showed the Basil Rathbone movies almost every week. And so I had read the stories, as I said, as a kid, the children's edited versions, and then seeing the Basil Rathbone movies sort of melded my gradual interest. So I would just, when I'd see something Sherlock Holmes related, like a TV movie or some, like new novel, like present day novel written by somebody current that dealt with Sherlock Holmes, then I would probably check it out. And there was a wave, a few years later, there was a wave of what we call Sherlockiana nationwide, because Nicholas Meyer had a bestseller with the 7% Solution, which was one of the first major books and bestsellers to deal with Sherlock Holmes. And then there was the subsequent film version. That also reinforced my interest in Sherlock Holmes. Yes, well, I remember reading one by Ellery Queen. They had made a film out of it too, but Ellery Queen did one that dealt with Holmes and Jack the Ripper. A familiar theme, but that was one of the first times I'd seen that issue addressed in the context of Sherlock Holmes. So, and then, as I said, Nicholas Meyer, who I've had the pleasure to meet a couple of times, had a couple of hits in the 70s. And so those two stand out in my memory from that time. And of course, over the years, it just became, and still is, kind of a cottage industry for anybody to write a Sherlock Holmes novel. And some are better than others. And so I've been very choosy in which ones I read, because the style of Conan Doyle is not terribly hard to imitate, but like any other good novel, it's the story, it's the plot, it's the characters that make the difference. And some of the lesser ones just weren't that interesting. And the better ones, of course, were strong in those departments.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you get to meet Nicholas Meyer?
Yes, I did. I first met him about 15 years ago at a convention of Holmesians or Sherlockians, pick your word, in Indianapolis. And he was one of the guest speakers there. And so I was able to get him to sign my copy of 7% Solution. And he's a really nice guy, got a very dry sense of humor, and has great stories about writing about Sherlock Holmes and writing and directing Star Trek movies. And then I saw him again, actually, just this past June in Louisville. This convention I was at was not for Sherlockians. It was more of a convention for people who make model kits, figurines and statues and models of characters, fictional characters, or characters from movies, whatever. But they were having a tribute to Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, the second Star Trek movie, because this is its 40th anniversary this year. So as part of that, they had Nicholas Meyer, who directed that version, as a guest speaker, and I got to see him again. Well, certainly Holmes and Watson, just the two of them, are just such a perfect collaboration. They're like the yin and yang, of mysteries. And the two of them just blended so well. And that's why in the better movies, when you have two really great actors playing those characters, it's just like icing on the cake. But probably, even though she's only in one story, Irene Adler, who outsmarted him in A Scandal in Bohemia, is always fun to watch because she's one of the few women in the whole canon, as they call it, of the Sherlock Holmes stories, who got the best of him. So, of course, the other characters like Inspector Lestrade and Mrs. Hudson are always fun. But probably, like I said, I would add, and Mycroft, Holmes's older and supposedly smarter brother. So between Holmes, Watson, and Mycroft, I'd say the three of them do it for me. Oh yes, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes'
Holmes' smarter brother. Yes.
yeah. I saw that too, and it's a nice, takeoff. I mean, it's Gene Wilder on his, in kind of a Mel Brooks mode, and it's fun to watch. And it had Dom DeLuise and Madeline Kahn, who I could watch in anything. But
and also Marty Feldman also.
That's right. Yes. So you had a great cast. I don't think it's maybe the best Holmes comedy, because that's one of the things I find tricky about Sherlock Holmes, especially when people are playing him, is that he's this mythical, fictional character, and if it's overdone, it becomes a caricature. I mean, like a comic book character. Yeah. And so that's why, because some people have just have gone overboard playing Holmes, and others who were more restrained and subtle, they're the ones who really pull off the character, because you've got to make this guy, a thinking machine. He doesn't have a lot of emotions. He's not the most sympathetic guy in the world, but you have to like him. And as I said, so you have to tread very carefully as an actor, just not to, as I said, go overboard and make him outlandish. Yeah, outside of Basil Rathbone, Peter Cushing is by far one of the best actors who's played Holmes as he should be. I mean, Cushing was always great in anything. But yes, his Sherlock Holmes, which he did in a couple of films and a brief British TV series, Cushing really gets it. And one of my personal favorites in the comedy vein is Without a Clue with Michael Caine and Ben Kingsley. And the great spin on that is that the premise of the plot is that Holmes does not exist, that Dr. Watson made him up and wrote all these stories. And so he hires this, lush actor played by Michael Caine to impersonate Sherlock Holmes. And, so people will say, I don't know you, Dr. Watson, but, you're Sherlock Holmes. And so it's a great comedy because Caine and Kingsley blend together so well. And they play it relatively straight, but it's very funny. Let's see. Well, probably my personal favorite in terms of actors who played Holmes would probably be Jeremy Brett, who was just brilliant in the Grenada series back in the 80s. And just, I had friends who say there were other great actors. They thought that Jeremy Brett was Sherlock Holmes. And I agree, because he added so much more to the character. He just, gave him so many nuances and physical things that you had not seen other actors do. And so, Brett to me just like came off the page. And I also have a very soft spot for Christopher Plummer and James Mason in Murdered by Decree.
How about Benedict Cumberbatch?
Well,
It's a different setting of the story. It's set more
yes,
modern times.
yeah, he's fine. It's certainly different because it's modern, and I thought they had a very good way of taking some of the old stories and making them current. To me, it was kind of an acquired taste for me. I thought it was good, but with reservations, just myself. I wasn't a huge fan, but I think it's well done. But I would kind of take it in small doses, if you get my drift.
That was Gordon Shriver, retired radio personality and a longtime friend and co-worker. Gord has written a biography on Boris Karloff, titled Boris Karloff, The Man Remembered, and published by Bear Manor Media. And you can find out more at bearmanormedia.com. Our next fan is longtime Atlanta actor Doug Kay, who I've known since about 1980. Doug has a rather personal experience with Sherlock Holmes, and he tells us about that.
Hey, how you doing? Thank you for inviting me to join this fan interview about Sherlock Holmes. And your first question is, how and when did you first get interested in Sherlock Holmes? I actually discovered Conan Doyle first with The Lost World. And can't remember exactly, that was in high school. Can't remember exactly when I started to get interested in Sherlock Holmes. But I know that I had already read the entire canon by the time I moved to Atlanta. And in the late 70s, started doing commercials for Sunshine department stores as Inspector Sunshine, dressed like Sherlock Holmes with a magnifying glass and pipe and everything, and full costume, which I still have someplace. And then really started to get into it, and collecting pastiches, comic book adaptations. And then in the early 80s, got involved with the Atlanta Radio Theater Company. It was just getting started. And one of the first things we did were audio adaptations of 2 Sherlock Holmes stories. And I believe that I did the adaptation of The Red-Headed League, which still remains one of my favorite stories just because of its convoluted silliness. My favorite characters, I always had a soft spot for Watson. And even though she's only in one official story, of course, Irene Adler. And I insist on using the American pronunciation instead of Irene. That always rang false to my ear. She was an American after all. My association with Holmes, besides doing the commercials and directing the story for the radio theater, in the early 80s, a friend of mine, Thomas E. Fuller, and I had already written a Dracula parody, which then turned into a musical. And the success of that caused us to say, well, what to do next? And we wrote a musical parody of Sherlock Holmes called Sherlock Holmes and the Crime of the Century, or Elementary, My Dear Watson. I had a lot of fun with that. I played Watson, besides helping with the script. And it was one of those kind of like, what's the one, Without a Clue? Where our Holmes was a bit of a dunderhead, and it's obvious that Watson is so enamored of Holmes' proficiency that he corrects everything in the stories. But it was the Crime of the Century. Our plot was it's the end of the 19th century, and Moriarty has figured out he hasn't yet committed the crime of the century, and he's only got a short time to do it. So he goes about in some nefarious ways, and Holmes and Watson and Irene join him, and they try to foil his dastardly plans to music. It's a lot of fun. Finally, well, I'm not even going to spoil the ending in case it does get produced again someplace. Because of my involvement with that, I got contacted by the local Sherlock Holmes group, the Confederates of the Wisteria Lodge, to join them. And I did, not as a regular member. I poked my head in from time to time. Sometimes their passion for Holmes was a little more intense, and the minutia that they delighted in only sometimes got to me. But I've become more of a Holmes fan since then. My favorite character who's played Holmes, it used to be Basil Rathbone. Then it became Benedict Cumberbatch. Absolutely loved what he did with the updated Holmes. But I felt that he and Martin Freeman had those characterizations down pat. Really made it live for me. And then that one episode where you actually get him back in Edwardian England. That was a treat. Like I mentioned, I did collect pastiches, and I still have a huge collection of pastiches. August Derleth had a series, Solar Ponds, that was almost Sherlock Holmes, and those were a lot of fun. I think after his initial series of books, author named Basil Copper, I believe, was the one who then picked up the books after that. But some of the earliest pastiches I picked up were the Giant Rat of Sumatra, the Hellbirds, of course, Nicholas Meyer's 2 early books, and I just found out he's written a couple of more of Holmes pastiches since 7% Solution and the West End Horror. I've yet to find those. And every now and then I do get an offer from BookBub for an online copy of a new one that I haven't heard of before. So I'll go ahead and invest in that. I have a complete collection of the stories that what's her name? The famous ones. But I've got a complete collection. I haven't even read any of those yet. Has Sherlock Holmes affected your life? Oh, most definitely. The commercials that I did for Sunshine Department Stores, after I did a series of other characters, including Santa Claus and Ebenezer Scrooge, we finally locked on to Inspector Sunshine, and I did, I think it was two and a half years worth of those, doing at least one new commercial every month. And as a AFTRA member, it's SAG-AFTRA now, but it was just AFTRA at that time, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, it did take care of my rent for a long time. So yeah, it did affect my life then. But also the very fact of his deductive reasoning. And that has been my approach to the characters I've played. I've been a Shakespearean actor for a long time, spent over 25 years with the Atlanta Shakespeare Company, working out of the Shakespeare Tavern. I've done all the Shakespeare canon except for 5 lesser-known plays. Played a slew of lords and dukes and not too many kings. Low peasants and high rulers, and my approach to those characters has been using Holmesian type of reasoning, seeing what I can pull out of the Shakespearean language. So, yeah, my success in that means that Holmes has affected my life that way. What else can I say about Sherlock Holmes and me? I did try to smoke the pipe that I had. It was a calabash, not a meerschaum, the one that's most visually identified with Holmes, even though I think it only appears in the Sidney Paget illustrations. I did attempt to actually smoke it a couple of times. Didn't work too well. And someplace I still have a relief wall hanging, a little a little figure, facial figure of Holmes. All that, I'm afraid, is in storage. God, I haven't even seen those in some time. But my books are still available for perusal. There was a very interesting thing. There was a minor comic book company did a series of Sherlock Holmes stories, and the illustrator was very good. And one of the early ones, I started to read it, and they had adapted The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet. And I put it down almost immediately. I never returned to that series again because neither the editor nor the artist or the writer had bothered to find out what a coronet was. And instead of a crown, especially since it talks about the whole thing about the story is you break off a corner of the coronet, and they've somehow made it this big bulky necklace. So I said, okay, if they're not going to be bothered to look up and find out what it is they're writing about, I'm not going to be bothered with enjoying your stories anymore. Let's see. And I think that's it. I've enjoyed Holmes for a good many years. I'm now in my mid-70s, and Holmes has played a large part in many of those years. I only wish that there were more Sherlock Holmes plays that I could be in besides the one I wrote. I know there are others. I just haven't had a chance to do them.
Longtime Atlanta actor and director Doug Kay. You should check out his page on IMDb. In 1996, he gave me, as a director, my favorite of Atlanta Radio Theater's productions with Thomas Fuller's All Hallows Moon, which you can check out on our website, www.artc.org. And you can also check us out on YouTube. Next, we go to Peachtree City resident and former president of the Confederates of the Wisteria Lodge, Kay Pinkney, for her comments on Sherlock Holmes.
I first heard about Sherlock Holmes Club in Atlanta because I read an article in the Atlanta Journal that was written by Sarah Cash, joined the club at the first meeting. It was a wonderful introduction to Sherlock Holmes. I was elected president, the first female president of the club in 1985, and really enjoyed that year. And there have been several women elected presidents since then. I have some favorite stories. Among them are The Blue Carbuncle, The Resident Patient, Second Stain, and The Scandal in Bohemia. I watched those over and over with Jeremy Brett playing Sherlock Holmes. He is Holmes to me. And the club was one of my social activities that I enjoyed the most. I have a lot of friends that were members of the club and still are. It's a really good group in Atlanta. Now it's called Wisteria Lodge, the Confederates of Wisteria Lodge, which was borrowed from a club in Charlotte that had disbanded. We call it the Sherlock Holmes Atlanta. We call it the Wisteria Lodge or Atlanta Sherlockian Society, I think. It's a public group on Facebook, and you can post whatever you want about Sherlock Holmes on the Facebook page. And you can post, I think I just said that, you can post stories. Some people try to sell their wares on the page. I have posted several times recently. It's a really interesting page to go to. We hope we'll get more members that way, having a Facebook page. The club has met virtually during the pandemic. I was able to go to one of those meetings and really enjoy it. And you can also join it on Zoom, which I've done before as well. I said that Jeremy Brett was my favorite Holmes. Also, Edward Hardwicke, I think, is my favorite Watson. He played along with Jeremy Brett. In the Scandal in Bohemia, I liked Irene Adler. In the Second Stain, I like Lady Hilda Trelawney Hope. In The Illustrious Client, I like Kitty Winter. The Resident Patient, I liked Holmes and Watson. I can't think of any more right now. But anyway, I know Holmes was not a big fan of women, but I really like watching the stories because they're so well told on public television. And I think I've watched most of the stories on public television and on my cell phone. I've been listening to them lately and watching the videos. I guess that's about it. What do you have to say about Sherlock Holmes?
Leave it to an interviewee to ask the interviewer a question. Well, Kay, I think that Sherlock Holmes has had an impact on my life. In my preteens, I would stay up late and watch the old Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce movies. As an adult, I bought the complete Sherlock Holmes facsimiles from the Strand magazine, which I still have and use. I used deductive reasoning as an audio engineer in working out how best to do recordings. My thanks to those participating in this podcast: Kay Pinckney, Gord Shriver, Doug Kay, and Tony Serecchia. If you wish more information on the Confederates of the Wisteria Lodge, go to the Facebook page, where you will find information on meetings, how to attend, club activities, and many more things you can do. I'm William Brown, former executive producer and founder of the Atlanta Radio Theater Company. Brian Smith is the coordinating producer. The theme for Fan Alley is by Alton Leonard. Fan Alley is a more or less bi-monthly podcast produced by your host, William Brown, at James Springs Studios. Be sure to click the like button and subscribe to the Atlanta Radio Theater Company. And join me for my next stroll down Fan Alley. Peace be with you, my friends.